Dear viewers, what happened at the World Economic Forum in Davos this week was not just about differences in leadership styles. It was the visible collapse of one era and the definitive emergence of another. On January 20th, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney took the main stage and delivered what analysts called the most important speech made by a Western leader in over a decade. His speech was met with a standing ovation from the global elite, who had watched in uncomfortable silence just days earlier as Donald Trump threatened to seize Greenland from a NATO ally. 24 hours later, Trump arrived in Davos, attempting to re-establish American dominance. But he revealed exactly what Carney had warned about: the death of predictable leadership and the rise of economic coercion as state governance. On Wednesday afternoon, Trump backed down from his tariff threats against 8 European countries and announced an ambiguous framework agreement with NATO that looked more like a retreat than a victory. The bully blinked, and the whole world noticed. The sequence of events matters because institutional memory operates in timelines, and Trump's Greenland obsession has been escalating for weeks. In early January, he began floating the idea that America should purchase or somehow acquire Greenland, describing it as essential for national security. When Denmark and Greenland flatly rejected the proposal, Trump's rhetoric intensified. He suggested military options were not off the table. He called Greenland a giant piece of ice that America deserved after defending it during World War II. On January 15th, he announced tariffs against 8 European countries: Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Denmark itself, set to begin February 1st at 10% and escalate to 25% by June, unless they supported American acquisition of Greenland. This was not subtle diplomacy. This was open extortion of NATO allies, and European capitals responded with alarm. Several nations immediately dispatched small military contingents to Greenland for joint exercises, a direct signal that Trump's threats would not intimidate them into compliance. Danish officials stated repeatedly that Greenland was not for sale, period, and that Denmark would defend its territorial integrity. The crisis triggered NATO Article 4 consultations, a formal mechanism used when member states perceive threats to their security. Trump had created the most serious intra-alliance crisis since the organization's founding. Into this volatile environment stepped Mark Carney. His Davos speech on January 20th came one day before Trump's scheduled appearance, and the timing was deliberate. Carney opened with a parable about a Czech greengrocer during communist rule who placed propaganda signs in his window, not because he believed them, but because compliance seemed safer than resistance. Carney then drew the parallel to contemporary global politics, where middle-sized democracies have participated in rituals of American-led order, even as the gaps between rhetoric and reality grew wider. He declared plainly that this bargain no longer works, that the world is experiencing a rupture, not a transition, and that great powers, including, but not explicitly naming the United States, are now weaponizing trade, using tariffs as leverage and treating economic integration as a vulnerability to exploit. His message was clear: middle powers must stop accommodating bullying and instead build coalitions based on shared values and mutual respect. The room erupted in applause. European leaders praised his clarity. Asian delegates requested meetings. Global media described it as the speech that captured the moment. Now consider what happened when Trump took the same stage 24 hours later, because the contrast could not have been more devastating for American credibility. Trump spoke for 72 minutes in a rambling address filled with his characteristic grievances, false claims, and personal attacks. He insisted repeatedly that America alone could defend Greenland, that Denmark was treating the United States unfairly, and that NATO members would never defend America if roles were reversed. He mocked European values, dismissed climate concerns, and threatened consequences for anyone who refused to accommodate his demands. The audience sat in visible discomfort. There were no standing ovations. International delegations began leaving before he finished speaking. One European ambassador described it afterward as watching someone dismantle their own authority in real time. But here's where Trump's performance became genuinely consequential for America's global position. He walked back his own threats on stage. When asked directly whether he would use military force to take Greenland, Trump said probably not, that he would not use force, that he did not want to use force. This represented a complete reversal from weeks of increasingly aggressive rhetoric suggesting military options remained on the table. The statement immediately undermined every tariff threat, every ultimatum, every demand he had made, because if military force was never credible, then what leverage did America actually possess? European leaders recognized instantly that Trump had been bluffing. And once a bluff is called publicly, it cannot be reestablished. Within hours, Trump posted on Truth Social that he and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte had formed the framework of a future deal with respect to Greenland, and in fact the entire Arctic region. He announced he would not impose the February 1st tariffs after all. The language was deliberately vague, filled with references to ongoing discussions and future opportunities, but the substance was unmistakable. Trump backed down completely from demands that had triggered NATO's most serious internal crisis in decades. Let us examine precisely what this framework actually represents, because the details matter far more than Trump's triumphant framing suggests. According to reports from inside the Davos meetings, NATO allies discussed a proposal where the United States might gain sovereignty over small pockets of Greenland for expanded military installations, essentially formalizing and slightly expanding arrangements that already exist under existing defense agreements. This is not American ownership of Greenland. This is not even meaningful expansion of American control. This is a face-saving formula that allows Trump to claim progress while Denmark retains full sovereignty and Greenland's government maintains its autonomy. One senior European official described it bluntly as giving Trump just enough to declare victory while changing absolutely nothing of substance. The so-called Golden Dome reference in Trump's statement reportedly refers to a symbolic structure or naming arrangement that would allow American branding on facilities that Denmark already permits America to operate. This is not territorial acquisition. This is public relations theater designed to let Trump retreat without admitting retreat. Meanwhile, the actual impact of this Davos week continues reverberating through global power structures in ways that favor Canada dramatically. Carney's speech has been translated into 23 languages and circulated among diplomatic corps worldwide as a defining articulation of the emerging post-American order. His specific policy proposals around variable geometry coalitions, where different groups of nations collaborate on specific issues without requiring universal consensus, are being actively discussed in European capitals, Asian foreign ministries, and Middle Eastern planning offices. The European Union leadership invited Carney for follow-up consultations on joint defense procurement and climate finance frameworks. Japan requested bilateral meetings on trade diversification and technology partnerships. Australia and New Zealand both reached out regarding Pacific security coordination. These are not symbolic gestures. These are operational discussions about building governance structures that function regardless of American participation or approval. Carney positioned Canada as the stable, reliable anchor that these nations need when traditional American leadership becomes unpredictable or actively hostile. The investment implications are equally significant. Canadian sovereign bonds saw immediate demand increases following Carney's Davos remarks as global capital managers repriced stability risk. The Toronto Stock Exchange outperformed New York markets for 3 consecutive trading days, an unusual pattern that analysts directly attributed to perceived governance quality differentials. Now some will argue that Trump's framework agreement represents successful negotiation, that he secured NATO commitments through pressure tactics, and that declaring victory regardless of substance is simply effective political messaging. This interpretation requires ignoring observable reality. Trump threatened 8 NATO allies with escalating tariffs over an issue those allies considered non-negotiable. He suggested military force might be necessary. He called their resistance unfair and ungrateful. Then he accepted a symbolic arrangement that changes nothing material about Greenland's status, while dropping all his threatened consequences. That is not successful negotiation. That is public humiliation dressed up as statesmanship. But here is the cruel irony that makes Trump's Davos performance so consequential. Every threat he issued, every alliance he strained, every norm he violated, it all served to validate precisely the message Mark Carney delivered about why middle powers can no longer rely on American leadership. Trump created the perfect illustration of Carney's thesis. When the Canadian Prime Minister warned that great powers were weaponizing economic integration and using coercion instead of cooperation, skeptics might have questioned whether such rhetoric was overblown. Then Trump showed up and threatened America's oldest allies with tariffs unless they surrendered sovereign territory. When Carney called for middle powers to build alternative coalitions, some might have wondered if such structures were necessary. Then Trump demonstrated in real time why they are essential. He validated Carney's entire strategic framework while simultaneously destroying the credibility required to oppose it. What Davos revealed this week was not simply a bad speech by one leader and a good speech by another. It was the visible transition of geopolitical gravity from a superpower that can no longer be trusted to a middle power that can. Mark Carney did not attack America. He did not demand Canada replace American leadership. He simply articulated why the old order is finished and proposed practical frameworks for what comes next. His proposals were reasonable, his tone was measured, his vision was achievable. Then Trump arrived and confirmed every concern that motivated Carney's remarks. The framework Trump announced changes nothing about Greenland while abandoning every threat he made. That is not strength. That is the desperate face saving of declining authority. The world watched both performances. They drew their conclusions, and increasingly those conclusions involve building systems that function without American approval. Canada no longer needs to ask for permission.